The fever that swept through Redemption Creek in the spring of 1878 started with old Mr. Patterson, and by the time it reached the third household, Sarah McKenna had already made her first pot of chicken soup. She was 22 years old, unmarried, and possessed a stubbornness that her late mother had always said would either save her or doom her, depending on the day. The townspeople whispered about her the way they always did about unmarried women who lived alone in a little house on the edge of town, but Sarah had never much cared for whispers. She cared about people who were suffering, and right now, Redemption Creek had plenty of those. Sarah's kitchen smelled of simmering broth and fresh bread as she ladled soup into a ceramic jar, wrapping it carefully in cloth to keep it warm. The Patterson family lived 3 streets over, and Mrs. Patterson had 5 children to care for while her husband lay sick with fever. Sarah knew what it was like to watch someone suffer, had held her mother's hand through consumption 2 winters ago, and she would not let her neighbors face illness alone if she could help it. The April sun beat down on her bonnet as she walked through the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, Colorado. The town sat in a valley surrounded by mountains still capped with snow, a place where miners and ranchers and shopkeepers tried to carve out lives from the harsh land. It was not an easy place, but it was home, and Sarah loved it with a fierceness that surprised even herself sometimes. Mrs. Patterson answered the door with dark circles under her eyes and a baby on her hip. "Oh, Sarah," she breathed, her voice cracking, "you should not be here. The fever might spread to you." "Then I will make soup for myself," Sarah said simply, handing over the jar and the small loaf of bread she had wrapped in paper. "How is Mr. Patterson?" "The same. The doctor came yesterday but said there was not much to do except wait and pray, Mrs. Patterson's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "The children are frightened." Sarah squeezed the woman's free hand. "They will see their father well again soon. Make sure he eats some of this soup, even just the broth if he cannot manage more. It will help him keep his strength." She left before Mrs. Patterson could protest further, already thinking about who else might need help. The fever had a strange pattern, striking seemingly at random. The blacksmith's daughter had it, as did one of the saloon girls and the family who ran the general store. By the end of the week, Sarah had made soup for 7 households, her hands raw from scrubbing vegetables and her back aching from carrying jars across town. The cowboy first noticed her on a Thursday morning when he rode into town with his trail boss and a dozen other ranch hands. His name was James Holloway, though most people called him Hollis, and he had spent the last 6 weeks moving cattle from winter pasture to spring grazing lands. He was 26, tall and lean with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of creek water in summer. He had been working ranches since he was 15, saving his money with a vague dream of someday owning land of his own. Hollis was tying his horse outside the general store when he saw her. She was a small woman with auburn hair escaping from beneath her bonnet, carrying a heavy basket that seemed too large for her frame. She walked with purpose, her chin set in a way that suggested she would not appreciate anyone suggesting she needed help. He watched as she climbed the steps to the doctor's office above the store, knocked, and waited. "That is Sarah McKenna," said his trail boss, Jack Morrison, following Hollis's gaze. "Town angel, some call her, been nursing half of Redemption Creek through this fever." "By herself?" Hollis asked. "Got no husband, no family left, just her and her stubbornness." Jack chuckled, but there was respect in his voice. "Dr. Sullivan says she has probably saved 3 or 4 lives with her care. People are more likely to eat when she brings food, and she checks on them regular, makes sure the fevers do not get too high." Hollis watched Sarah disappear into the doctor's office, something stirring in his chest that he could not quite name. He had known plenty of women in his 26 years, but there was something about the set of her shoulders, the determination in her walk, that caught his attention in a way he had not expected. He did not see her again that day, though he found himself looking for her as he and the other ranch hands conducted their business in town. They needed supplies for the ranch, and Jack wanted to meet with the banker about a loan for breeding stock. Hollis spent the afternoon loading flour and beans and coffee into the wagon, his mind wandering to the woman with auburn hair. That night, in the bunkhouse at the Morrison Ranch 12 miles outside of town, Hollis lay awake listening to the other men snore. He could not shake the image of Sarah McKenna from his mind. It was foolish, he told himself. He had seen her for all of 30 seconds. But something about her had reached inside him and taken hold, and he could not explain it even to himself. Sarah, meanwhile, was too exhausted to think about cowboys or anything else except sleep. She had delivered soup to 9 families that day, including the doctor's own household, where his wife had come down with the fever. Dr. Sullivan was beside himself with worry, and Sarah had promised to check on Mrs. Sullivan the next morning. Her feet throbbed as she finally stumbled into her own small house, barely managing to wash her face before falling into bed. The fever continued its march through Redemption Creek for another week. Sarah made soup until she ran out of chicken, then switched to beef, then to vegetable when meat became scarce. The butcher, Mr. Chen, who had come to Colorado from San Francisco 5 years ago, started saving bones for her, refusing payment. "You are doing God's work," he said in his careful English. "I help how I can." The whole town seemed to rally around Sarah's efforts. The baker left extra loaves on her doorstep in the early morning. Mrs. Gonzalez, who ran the boarding house, dropped off vegetables from her garden. Even the saloon owner, a gruff man named Billy Watts, sent over a bottle of whiskey with a note that said it was for medicinal purposes. Hollis came back to town the following Saturday with Jack and a few other ranch hands. They were there to pick up a part for the windmill that had been ordered from Denver and to let the men blow off some steam at the saloon. Hollis was not much of a drinker, never had been. His father had been a drunk, and Hollis had seen firsthand where that road led. But he went along with the others, nursing a single beer while they played cards and told stories. He saw Sarah through the saloon window just as the sun was setting. She was carrying another basket, this one covered with a checkered cloth, and she looked thinner than she had the week before. Her dress hung a little looser on her frame, and there were dark circles under her eyes that he could see even from a distance. "She is going to work herself into a grave," muttered Pete, one of the older ranch hands following Hollis's gaze. "Someone should tell her to rest." "You think she would listen?" Jack asked, dealing another hand of cards. "No," Pete admitted, "but someone should try." Hollis found himself standing before he had consciously decided to move. "I will be back," he told the others, setting down his beer. "Where are you going?" Jack called after him, but Hollis was already out the door. He caught up with Sarah 2 streets over, where she was climbing the steps to a small house with peeling paint. "Ma'am," he called, and she turned, startled. Up close, she was even prettier than he had thought, with green eyes that held both warmth and wariness. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but cautious. She was alone in the darkening street with a strange man, and Hollis realized he should have thought this through better. "I am sorry to startle you," he said quickly, taking off his hat. "My name is James Holloway. I work at the Morrison Ranch." "I just wanted to say that what you are doing for this town is remarkable." Sarah blinked, clearly not sure how to respond. "I am just bringing soup to sick people," she said finally. "It is not remarkable, it is just what you do for neighbors." "Most people would not," Hollis said. "Most people would be afraid of catching the fever themselves." "Then most people are more sensible than I am," Sarah said, but there was a hint of a smile on her lips. "Was there something you needed, Mr. Holloway?" He had not planned past catching up with her, and now he stood there feeling like a fool. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right," he said lamely. "You look tired." The wariness came back into her eyes. "I am fine," she said firmly. "Now, if you will excuse me, the Hendersons are waiting for this soup." She turned and knocked on the door, and Hollis had no choice but to tip his hat and walk away. But as he headed back to the saloon, he could not stop thinking about her. about the stubborn set of her jaw and the way she had looked at him like he was either very kind or very stupid, and she was not sure which. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur for Sarah. The fever finally began to recede, with families recovering one by one. Mr. Patterson went back to work at the mill, Mrs. Sullivan regained her strength, and the blacksmith's daughter was seen playing in the street again. Sarah felt a deep satisfaction at seeing the town come back to life, even as her own energy flagged. She had lost weight, though she barely noticed. Food was something she prepared for others, and eating felt like a waste of time when there was so much work to do. She slept in brief snatches, always worried that someone would take a turn for the worse in the night. When old Mr. Chen at the butcher shop expressed concern about her pallor, she waved him off with a tired smile. Hollis came to town twice more during those weeks, always finding excuses to ride down from the ranch. He told Jack he needed to pick up tobacco, or check on the order of nails for the new barn they were building, but the truth was he wanted to see Sarah. He caught glimpses of her here and there, always moving, always carrying something to someone. Once he saw her sitting on a bench outside the church, her eyes closed and her face turned to the sun, and she looked so peaceful that he did not have the heart to interrupt. He asked about her in careful, casual ways. From the baker, he learned that she had lived in Redemption Creek all her life, that her father had died in a mining accident when she was 12, and her mother had passed from consumption 2 years ago. From Mrs. Gonzalez at the boarding house, he learned that Sarah supported herself by taking in sewing and mending, and that she was known for her skill with a needle. From the doctor, who Hollis met by chance outside the bank, he learned that Sarah had a gentle touch with the sick and a good instinct for when someone needed more help than they were asking for. She would make someone a fine wife, Dr. Sullivan said, giving Hollis a knowing look. But she has turned down every man who has asked. I think she is waiting for someone who sees past the fact that she has no family money or connections. Hollis thought about this as he rode back to the ranch that evening. He had never been the sort of man who thought much about marriage. His life was cattle and horses and wide open spaces, sleeping under the stars and moving with the seasons. But something about Sarah McKenna made him wonder what it might be like to have a home, a real home, with a woman who looked at the world the way she did. By the first week of May, the fever had finally run its course through Redemption Creek. No new cases had appeared in over a week, and the last of the sick were well on their way to recovery. The town held a small celebration in the street outside the church, with tables set up and everyone bringing food to share. It was not much, just neighbors gathering in gratitude that the worst had passed, but it felt like a new beginning. Sarah came to the celebration wearing her best dress, a blue calico that brought out the green of her eyes. People kept stopping her to thank her, to press her hand or kiss her cheek, or simply smile at her with tears in their eyes. Mrs. Patterson insisted Sarah sit with her family and old Mr. Chen brought her a plate piled high with food that he had prepared specially. "You must eat," he insisted. "You are too thin. You have been taking care of everyone but yourself." Sarah laughed and promised to eat every bite, though the food sat heavy in her stomach. She felt strange, lightheaded, and not quite real, as if she were watching the celebration from a distance. She attributed it to exhaustion and the odd feeling of having nothing urgent to do for the first time in weeks. Hollis was there too, having ridden into town with Jack and several other ranch hands specifically for the celebration. He stood at the edge of the gathering, watching Sarah laugh with the Patterson children, watching her accept thanks and praise with a modest shake of her head. She glowed in the evening light, and his heart ached with wanting to know her, to be someone she might smile at that way. He almost went to her a dozen times, but each time he talked himself out of it. What would he say? He was just a cowboy, a ranch hand with dreams but little to offer. She was beloved by this town, a woman who deserved someone better than him. But then she looked up, her eyes scanning the crowd, and for a moment their gazes met. She smiled, A small, questioning smile, and before he could overthink it, Hollis was walking toward her. "Mr. Holloway," she said as he approached, her voice warm. "I did not expect to see you here." "I wanted to celebrate with the town," he said, his hat in his hands. "And I wanted to thank you properly. You saved a lot of people." "I just made soup," she said, but her cheeks flushed pink at the compliment. "It was more than soup," Holly said seriously. "It was caring. It was showing up every day even when you must have been exhausted. That is not something just anyone would do." Sarah looked down at her hands, suddenly shy. "You are very kind to say so." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, and then Holly said, "Would you like to take a walk? It is a nice evening." Sarah hesitated, and Holly's heart sank, but then she nodded. "I would like that," she said softly. They walked away from the celebration, down the main street of Redemption Creek as the sun set behind the mountains. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink and purple, and the air had the clean, cool smell of mountain springtime. They talked about small things at first, the weather and the town and the ranch. But gradually the conversation deepened. Sarah told him about her parents, about how her father had dreamed of striking it rich in the mines but had died before he ever found gold. About how her mother had worked her fingers to the bone sewing for other people, teaching Sarah everything she knew. About how lonely the house had felt after her mother died, and how taking care of the sick had given her a sense of purpose. Hollis told her about growing up in Texas, about his father's drinking and his mother's quiet sadness. About how he had left home at 15 to work ranches, sending money back when he could. About how his mother had died 3 years ago and he had not been there when it happened. About his dream of owning land someday, of building something that was his. "That is a good dream," Sarah said softly. "Land of your own, a place to belong. Do you ever think about leaving Redemption Creek?" Hollis asked. Sarah considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But this is home. These people are my family, in a way. I cannot imagine starting over somewhere where no one knows me." They had reached the edge of town, where Sarah's little house sat by itself near the creek. It was a humble place, just 3 rooms with a small porch, but she had made it as cozy as she could. Flowers grew in boxes beneath the windows, and a rocking chair sat on the porch where she liked to sew in the evenings. "This is me," she said, gesturing to the house. "Thank you for the walk." "It was nice to talk to someone." "It was nice for me too," Holly said. He wanted to ask if he could see her again, wanted to find a reason to come back to town, but the words stuck in his throat. Sarah smiled at him, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Good night, Mr. Holloway." "Hollis," he said. "Please call me Hollis." "Good night, Hollis," she said, and went inside. Hollis walked back to where the horses were tied, his mind spinning. He had never felt this way about anyone, this pull that was both exciting and terrifying. Jack took one look at his face and grinned. "You have got it bad," Jack said. "I do not know what you are talking about," Hollis muttered, but he could not quite suppress his own smile. The next week passed in a pleasant haze for Sarah. She went back to her sewing, taking in mending and making a new dress for Mrs. Gonzalez's daughter. The town had settled back into its normal rhythms, and Sarah felt like she could finally breathe again. But she found herself thinking about Hollis at odd moments, remembering the serious look in his eyes when he talked about his dreams, the gentle way he had listened to her stories. She told herself not to be foolish. He was a ranch hand who probably came to town once a month, if that. He had been kind to her, but that did not mean anything. Men were kind to her all the time, and it never led anywhere. Sarah had long ago accepted that she would probably never marry, and she had made her peace with it. Mostly. But then Tuesday morning came, and with it a familiar ache in her bones that she tried to ignore. She had work to do, a pile of mending that Mrs. Patterson needed by the end of the week. She pushed through the morning, her needle flashing as she repaired a torn shirt, but by noon she could no longer pretend that she was fine. The fever came on suddenly and hard, like nothing Sarah had ever experienced. One moment she was sitting at her sewing table, and the next she was shivering so violently that she dropped her needle. She tried to stand, thinking she should get herself to bed, but her legs would not hold her. She managed to stumble to the bedroom, pulling a quilt over herself as the chills racked her body. She lost track of time after that. The fever dreams came in waves, vivid and terrifying. She dreamed of her mother, of reaching for her hand but never quite touching it. She dreamed of a vast emptiness where she wandered alone, calling for someone but hearing no answer. She dreamed of drowning in a cold creek, the water closing over her head while she struggled to breathe. Mrs. Patterson found her 2 days later. When Sarah had not appeared at church on Sunday and had not answered her door on Monday, Mrs. Patterson had grown worried and looked through the window. She had run for Dr. Sullivan, who had come immediately and confirmed what they all feared. Sarah had the fever, and it had hit her harder than it had hit anyone else in town. She wore herself down taking care of everyone else, the doctor said grimly, checking Sarah's pulse and finding it thready and weak. Her body had nothing left to fight with when she finally caught it. Word spread through Redemption Creek like wildfire. The woman who had taken care of everyone was now desperately ill herself, and the town rallied in a way they never had before. Mrs. Gonzalez organized a schedule so that someone was always with Sarah, bathing her forehead with cool cloths and trying to get her to drink water. The baker brought bread and the butcher brought broth, though Sarah could barely swallow any of it. On the 3rd day of Sarah's illness, Jack Morrison came to town on business and heard the news. He knew immediately that he had to tell Hollis, though he was not sure what the young cowboy could do about it. When he got back to the ranch that evening, he found Hollis in the barn, brushing down his horse after a long day of mending fences. "Sarah McKenna is sick," Jack said without preamble. "She has the fever bad." The brush fell from Hollis's hand. "How bad?" "Doctor says it does not look good." "She is barely conscious, cannot keep anything down. Her body is too worn out from all that work she did." Jack shook his head. "Whole town is beside themselves. She saved so many of them, and now there is not much they can do except wait." Hollis did not remember making the decision to go to her. He just knew that he had to, that the thought of Sarah suffering alone was unbearable. He saddled his horse in record time, ignoring Jack's warnings about riding in the dark, about how there was nothing he could do that the doctor was not already doing. "I have to go," was all Hollis said, and then he was riding hard for Redemption Creek, his horse's hooves thundering across the dark prairie. He reached Sarah's house just after midnight. There was a lamp burning in the window, and when he knocked on the door, Mrs. Patterson answered. She looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying. "Mr. Holloway," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "What are you doing here?" "I heard about Sarah," he said. "Please, I need to see her, Mrs." Patterson studied him for a long moment, and whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her because she stepped aside. "She is not conscious," she warned. "She has not been for hours." The little bedroom was stifling, the air thick with the smell of sickness. Sarah lay in the narrow bed, her face flushed with fever and her hair damp with sweat. She looked so small, so fragile, that Hollis's heart nearly broke. He knelt beside the bed, taking her burning hand in his. "Sarah," he whispered, "I am here." She did not respond, just turned her head restlessly on the pillow. Mrs. Patterson came to stand beside him, a bowl of water and cloth in her hands. "We have been trying to keep her cool," she said, "but the fever will not break. Dr. Sullivan says we just have to wait and pray." "Let me help," Hollis said. "Please, I can sit with her." Mrs. Patterson looked like she wanted to protest, but she was too tired to argue. "I need to get home to my children," she admitted. "Mrs. Gonzalez is supposed to come in a few hours to relieve me, if you can stay until then." "I will stay as long as she needs me," Hollis said firmly. After Mrs. Patterson left, Hollis settled into the chair beside Sarah's bed. He dipped the cloth in cool water and gently bathed her face, her neck, her arms. He talked to her in a low, steady voice, telling her about the ranch, about the cattle and the horses, about anything he could think of. He told her about the first time he had seen her, carrying that heavy basket with such determination. He told her that she had to get better, that the town needed her, that he needed her, though she could not hear him. The night stretched long and dark. Sarah's fever raged, her body shaking with chills one moment and burning up the next. Hollis changed the water in the bowl over and over, never leaving her side. Once she opened her eyes and looked at him, but there was no recognition in her gaze, just confusion and pain. "You are safe," he told her. "I am here, you are going to be all right." As dawn broke, Mrs. Gonzalez arrived and stopped short when she saw Hollis still sitting beside Sarah's bed. "You stayed all night?" she asked, her voice soft with surprise. "I will stay as long as it takes," Hollis said. Mrs. Gonzalez came closer, checking Sarah's forehead with a practiced hand. "The fever is still high," she said worriedly. "But at least it is not worse. Let me make some broth. If we can get her to drink even a little, it will help." While Mrs. Gonzalez worked in the kitchen, Hollis continued his vigil. He remembered what Sarah had done for so many others, how she had shown up day after day with soup and care and determination. She had made soup for everyone who was sick, had given so much of herself that there was nothing left when her own illness came. He understood now what that meant, the depth of her caring, and he loved her for it even as he raged against the unfairness of it. Mrs. Gonzalez returned with a cup of broth. Together they managed to get a few spoonfuls into Sarah, though most of it dribbled down her chin. It was something, though. "It was better than nothing. You should rest," Mrs. Gonzalez told Hollis. "You look dead on your feet." "I am fine," Hollis said, though his eyes burned with exhaustion and his back ached from sitting in the chair all night. Word got out that the cowboy from the Morrison Ranch was sitting with Sarah McKenna, and the town found itself charmed by the devotion of this young man that most of them barely knew. Jack rode in later that morning with a change of clothes for Hollis and strict instructions from the ranch foreman that Hollis was to take whatever time he needed. "Boss says you are not to worry about work," Jack told him. "He remembers what it is like to be young and in love." "I am not in love," Hollis protested weakly, but Jack just laughed. "Tell that to someone who did not see your face when I told you she was sick," Jack said. "Take care of her, we will manage at the ranch." The second day was worse than the first. Sarah's fever climbed higher and she became delirious, calling out for her mother, for people Hollis did not know. The doctor came twice, his face grave, and admitted that there was little he could do that was not already being done. "She is strong," Dr. Sullivan said, as much to reassure himself as Hollis. "She has a will to live. That counts for something." Hollis held onto those words as he continued to care for Sarah. He bathed her face and hands, changed the sheets when they became soaked with sweat, held a cup to her lips and coaxed her to drink. He talked to her constantly, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep, telling her stories about his childhood, about the places he had been, about the life he wanted to build. He told her things he had never told anyone, secrets and dreams and fears, because somehow it felt safe to say them to her sleeping form. On the third night, Sarah's fever finally broke. Hollis had dozed off in the chair, his head resting on the edge of her bed, when he felt her hand move in his. He jerked awake to find her eyes open, clear and focused for the first time in days. "Hollis," she whispered, her voice raw and confused. "What are you doing here?" Relief flooded through him so powerfully that he had to blink back tears. "You have been sick," he said, his voice rough. "You had the fever." "I had the fever." Sarah tried to sit up, but she was too weak. "How long?" "4 days. You scared us all half to death." Hollis poured water from the pitcher and held the cup to her lips. "Drink slowly." Sarah drank, and it was the most beautiful thing Hollis had ever seen. She was weak and pale and her hair was a mess, but she was alive and conscious and herself again. "You stayed with me," she said wonderingly, as memory started to piece itself together. "I remember your voice. I thought I was dreaming." "I could not leave you," Hollis said simply. "Not when you needed help." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. "I do not understand. Why would you do this for me? You barely know me." Hollis took her hand, holding it carefully. "I know that you are the bravest, kindest woman I have ever met." I know that you took care of this whole town without thinking about yourself. I know that from the moment I saw you, I have not been able to stop thinking about you." He took a deep breath. "And I know that sitting here, afraid you might die, made me realize that I want to know everything about you. I want to be part of your life if you will let me." Sarah stared at him, more tears streaming down her face. "You are serious." "I have never been more serious about anything," Hollis said. "I must look terrible," Sarah said, trying to smile through her tears. "You look alive," Hollis said. "That is all that matters to me." Sarah laughed, a weak sound that turned into a cough. But her hand tightened on his, and when she looked at him, there was something new in her eyes, something warm and wondering and full of possibility. News of Sarah's recovery spread through Redemption Creek as quickly as news of her illness had. People came to visit, bringing food and flowers and gratitude. The house that had felt so empty after her mother died was suddenly full of laughter and conversation and life. And through it all, Hollis stayed, helping Sarah when she was too weak to stand, sitting with her in comfortable silence, making her laugh with stories about stubborn cattle and mischievous horses. It took Sarah nearly 2 weeks to regain her strength, and Hollis was there for all of it. Jack brought him things from the ranch as needed, and the ranch foreman sent word that Hollis's job would be waiting for him whenever he was ready to come back. But Hollis was in no hurry. For the first time in his life, he had found something more important than work, more important than his dreams of owning land. He had found someone he wanted to build those dreams with. They fell into an easy routine. In the mornings, Hollis would help Sarah with the chickens she kept in her small yard, collecting eggs and making sure they had water. Then he would cook breakfast, simple fare like eggs and bacon and coffee, and they would eat together on the porch in the cool morning air. Sarah would sew, her needle moving in steady rhythms that Hollis found soothing to watch, while he repaired things around her house that had been neglected. A loose board on the porch, a shutter that hung crooked, a leak in the roof above the kitchen. In the afternoons, they would take short walks as Sarah rebuilt her strength. At first just to the end of her street and back, and then gradually farther, until they could walk all the way to the church and back without Sarah getting winded. They talked constantly, learning each other's stories, sharing opinions on everything from the best way to cook beans to whether Colorado would ever be as settled as the eastern states. Hollis told Sarah about his dream of owning a ranch, of having horses and cattle of his own. He had been saving money for years, he explained, keeping it in the bank in Redemption Creek. He was close now, so close he could taste it. Another year or two of work, and he might have enough for a down payment on a piece of land. Sarah told Hollis about her work as a seamstress, how she loved the precision of it, the way you could take something torn and broken and make it whole again. She showed him the quilt she had been working on, made from scraps of fabric left over from other projects, each piece carrying a memory. This blue calico from Mrs. Patterson's daughter's dress, that brown gingham from Mr. Chen's Sunday shirt. They talked about harder things too. Hollis told Sarah about his father's violence when he drank, about the fear he had carried as a child, about the guilt he felt for leaving his mother even though he knew he had to. Sarah told Hollis about the loneliness that had swallowed her after her mother died, about the nights she had cried herself to sleep in the empty house, about the fear that she would always be alone. "You are not alone anymore," Hollis said one evening as they sat on her porch watching the sun set. "I am here, and I am not going anywhere unless you tell me to." Sarah looked at him, this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had not known she was praying. "I do not want you to go," she said softly. Hollis reached over and took her hand, and they sat in silence as the sky turned from gold to pink to purple. It was a perfect moment, simple and profound, and Sarah felt something in her chest unfold like a flower opening to the sun. By the end of May, Sarah was fully recovered, and Hollis knew he needed to go back to work at the ranch. The spring calving was done, but there was still plenty to do, and he could not impose on Jack's generosity forever. The thought of leaving Sarah made him ache, but he had responsibilities and he had been raised to honor those. "I need to go back to the ranch," he told Sarah one morning over breakfast. "But I will come to town every Sunday if that is all right with you, and any other time I can manage." "Of course it is all right," Sarah said, though her heart sank at the thought of not seeing him every day. "You have already given me so much time, you have a life to live." "My life is better with you in it," Hollis said seriously. "These past weeks have been the happiest I have ever known." Sarah felt her cheeks flush. "For me too," she admitted. Before he left, Hollis did something he had been thinking about for days. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small carved wooden bird no bigger than his palm. He had made it in the evenings when Sarah was sleeping, whittling by lamplight with his pocket knife. "I am not much of a carver," he said, suddenly shy, "but I wanted you to have something to remember me by when I am not here." Sarah took the bird, running her fingers over the smooth wood. It was a simple thing but made with care, and it meant more to her than any expensive gift could have. "It is beautiful," she said, tears pricking her eyes. "I will treasure it." Hollis left soon after, riding back to the Morrison ranch with a lightness in his heart despite the ache of leaving Sarah behind. He had found something he had not been looking for, and it had changed everything. True to his word, Hollis came to town every Sunday. He would attend church with Sarah, sitting beside her in the pew and singing hymns in a surprisingly good baritone. After church, they would have dinner at her house or sometimes at the boarding house where Mrs. Gonzalez would feed them until they could not eat another bite. They would spend the afternoon together, walking or sitting on her porch or just being in each other's company. And then, too soon, it would be evening, and Hollis would have to ride back to the ranch. The town watched their courtship with approval and delight. Sarah had been alone for so long, and everyone loved the idea of her finding happiness with the cowboy who had cared for her so devotedly. Mrs. Patterson declared it the most romantic thing she had ever seen, and even crusty, old Billy Watts at the saloon admitted that the cowboy had proven himself to be a good man. Summer came to the Colorado mountains in a blaze of wildflowers and long golden days. Hollis taught Sarah to ride, putting her on his gentlest horse and leading her around the meadow outside town. Sarah was terrified at first, but Hollis was patient, and gradually she learned to relax and trust the animal beneath her. By July, they were taking long rides into the mountains together, exploring trails and swimming in cold mountain streams. One Sunday in August, Hollis took Sarah to see a piece of land he had been looking at. It was about 10 miles from town, a beautiful valley with a creek running through it and mountains rising on 3 sides. There was a small cabin already built, rough but sturdy, and good grazing for cattle. "The man who owns it is willing to sell," Hollis told Sarah as they stood looking out over the valley. "I have been saving for years, and I almost have enough. I could make an offer, maybe get him to hold it for me while I come up with the rest." "It is perfect," Sarah said, imagining cattle dotting the meadow, imagining a garden beside the cabin, imagining a life here. Hollis turned to her, his heart pounding. He had been planning this for weeks, but now that the moment was here, he was terrified. "Sarah, I know we have not known each other very long, just a few months, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life." He took her hands in his. "I love you. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you care for people. I love how you laugh at my stupid jokes and how you are not afraid to tell me when I am being foolish. I love everything about you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Hollis," she whispered, "I want to buy this land and build a life here," Hollis continued. "But more than that, I want to build it with you. Sarah McKenna, will you marry me?" For a moment, Sarah could not speak. Joy rose in her chest so powerfully that she thought she might burst with it. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, of course I will marry you." Hollis let out a whoop of joy and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until they were both laughing and dizzy. When he set her down, he kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise. It was Sarah's first kiss, and it was everything she had ever dreamed it might be. They were married in September, when the aspens had turned gold and the air had the crisp promise of autumn. The whole town turned out for the wedding, cramming into the little church until people had to stand in the aisles. Sarah wore a dress she had made herself, cream-colored with lace at the collar and cuffs, and she carried wildflowers that Mrs. Patterson's daughters had picked that morning. Hollis wore his best clothes, his hair slicked back and his boots polished to a shine. When Sarah walked down the aisle on Dr. Sullivan's arm, Hollis felt his throat tighten with emotion. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was his. This brave, caring woman had chosen him, and he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never regretted it. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They exchanged vows in front of God and the community that had become their family. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in cheers and applause. Hollis kissed his bride, and Sarah felt like she was flying. The reception was held in the street outside the church, with tables laden with food that the townspeople had prepared. There was music and dancing, and more than a few people wiping away happy tears. Mrs. Gonzalez had made a cake and Mr. Chen had roasted a pig, and the celebration went on until the stars came out. Jack Morrison gave a toast that made everyone laugh and cry in equal measure. "I have known Hollis for 5 years," he said, raising his glass, "and I have never seen him as happy as he has been since he met Sarah. She is the best thing that ever happened to him, and he knows it. To the bride and groom, may they have a long and happy life together." "To the bride and groom," everyone echoed, and Sarah and Hollis kissed again to more cheers. They spent their wedding night at Sarah's house, which would be their home until they could move to the ranch. Hollis had made an offer on the land, and the owner had accepted, agreeing to let Hollis pay half now and the rest over the next year. It was a risk, stretching his savings so thin, but Hollis was confident he could make it work. He had a job at the Morrison Ranch and Sarah had her sewing. Together they would manage. That night, as they lay in bed with moonlight streaming through the window, Sarah traced the lines of Hollis's face with her fingers. "I cannot believe this is real," she whispered. "I cannot believe I get to be this happy." "Believe it," Hollis said, pulling her close. "This is just the beginning, Sarah Holloway. We have our whole lives ahead of us." Sarah smiled at her new name. Sarah Holloway. It sounded right, like a door opening to a future she had not dared to imagine. The next months were a whirlwind of work and planning. Hollis continued working at the Morrison Ranch, saving every penny he could toward the final payment on their land. Sarah took on extra sewing, working late into the night to finish orders. On Sundays, they would ride out to their property and dream about improvements. A barn here, a corral there, a bigger garden, maybe some fruit trees. They moved to the ranch in November, right before the first snow. The cabin was small, just 2 rooms, but Sarah set about making it a home. She made curtains for the windows and rugs for the floor. She painted the walls white to make the space feel larger and arranged her mother's furniture as best she could in the limited space. Hollis built her a larger table so she could continue her sewing work, and he added a small porch where they could sit in the evenings. The winter was hard but beautiful. Snow blanketed the valley, and they were often cut off from town for days at a time, but Sarah did not mind. She had Hollis and their little cabin and the quiet peace of the mountains. They read to each other in the evenings by lamplight, played cards, and made plans for the spring. Hollis taught Sarah about ranching, about what they would need to do to make the land productive. They would start small, he explained, maybe a dozen cattle and a few horses. As they made money, they could expand. It would take years to build the kind of ranch he dreamed of, but they had time. They had each other. In February, Sarah realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but when she missed her second monthly course, she was sure. She told Hollis one evening over dinner, simply stating the fact and then watching his face as the news sank in. Hollis stared at her for a long moment, and then a smile spread across his face like sunrise. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," Sarah said, laughing at his expression. In the fall, I think, September or October. Hollis came around the table and pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of glass. I am going to be a father, he said, awe in his voice. We are going to be parents. They held each other as snow fell softly outside, and Sarah felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. She had been alone for so long, and now she had everything. A husband who loved her, a home, and a baby on the way. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for. Spring came late to the mountains that year, but when it finally arrived, it was glorious. Hollis used the last of their savings to buy 10 cows and a bull, along with 2 horses besides his own. It was not much, but it was a start. He built a corral and a small barn, working from dawn until dusk while Sarah kept the house and tended her garden. Her pregnancy progressed well, though she was often tired and sick in the mornings. Hollis was endlessly solicitous, bringing her tea in bed and insisting she rest more than she wanted to. Sarah found it both annoying and endearing, this evidence of how much he cared. In June, Jack Morrison came to visit with news. The owner of the ranch next to theirs was looking to sell some of his land, about 50 acres that bordered Hollis's property on the east side. It was good grazing land with water access, and the price was reasonable. I cannot afford it, Hollis said regretfully, doing the math in his head. Not yet, maybe in a few years. But Jack had a proposal. What if we went in together, he suggested. I have some money saved, and I have been thinking about leaving the Morrison Ranch and starting my own operation. We could be partners, split the costs and the profits. We could run our cattle together, share the work. Hollis looked at Sarah, who had come out to the porch when she heard Jack's voice. She gave a small nod, trusting his judgment. Let me think about it, Hollis said. I need to look at the numbers, figure out if we can make it work. They talked long into the night after Jack left, weighing the risks and benefits. It would be tight financially, especially with a baby coming. But it would also mean doubling their grazing land and having a partner to help with the heavy work. In the end, they decided to take the risk. The partnership with Jack proved to be one of the best decisions they ever made. Jack was a hard worker and a fair man, and together they built something neither could have built alone. By the time Sarah's baby was born in late September, they had expanded their herd to 30 cattle and had plans to buy more in the spring. Sarah's labor began on a cool autumn evening when the aspens were dropping their golden leaves like coins. Hollis rode to town to fetch Dr. Sullivan and Mrs. Gonzalez, his heart in his throat the entire way. By the time he got back with them, Sarah was in hard labor, gripping the bedframe and trying not to scream. It was a long night. Hollis paced outside the cabin, unable to bear listening to Sarah's pain but unwilling to go far. Jack stayed with him, offering whiskey that Hollis declined and conversation that Hollis barely heard. All he could think about was Sarah, about the possibility that something might go wrong, about how he would survive if he lost her. But Sarah was strong, stronger than anyone gave her credit for. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, her baby finally arrived. A boy, red-faced and squalling, perfect in every way. Dr. Sullivan brought the baby out wrapped in a blanket. "You have a son," he said, grinning, "and your wife is tired but well. She is asking for you." Hollis went inside on shaking legs. Sarah lay in the bed, her hair damp with sweat and her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes were bright with joy. The baby lay on her chest, already rooting for milk. "We have a son," she said wonderingly as Hollis knelt beside the bed. "You did it," Hollis said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are amazing. He is amazing." They named him Thomas after Sarah's father, Tommy for short. He had Hollis's eyes and Sarah's nose and a cry that could wake the dead. Sarah took to motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else, though she was often exhausted and overwhelmed. Hollis helped as much as he could, walking Tommy in the night when he fussed, changing diapers without complaint, and marveling at how something so small could change everything so completely. The ranch continued to grow. They bought more cattle, expanded their herd, and started selling beef to buyers in Denver. Money was still tight, but they were making it work. Sarah took in less sewing as Tommy took up more of her time, but she still worked when she could, her needle flashing while Tommy napped in a cradle Hollis had made. When Tommy was 6 months old, Sarah became pregnant again. It was sooner than they had planned, but they were both delighted. This time she knew what to expect, and the pregnancy was easier. She gave birth in May to a daughter they named Catherine, Kathy for short. She had Sarah's auburn hair and a quiet disposition that was nothing like her boisterous brother. Life settled into a rhythm. Hollis and Jack worked the ranch while Sarah managed the house and children. It was hard work, all of it, but it was good work. They were building something together, a life and a legacy. On Sundays, they would sometimes ride into town for church, and Sarah would see her old neighbors and remember the spring when she had made soup for everyone. It felt like a lifetime ago, though it had only been a few years. The children grew. Tommy became a toddler, then a little boy, curious about everything and fearless in a way that terrified Sarah. Kathy was quieter, content to sit and watch the world around her. Sarah loved them both with a fierceness that sometimes frightened her, this overwhelming need to keep them safe and happy. When Tommy was 4 and Kathy was 2, Sarah became pregnant for a third time. This pregnancy was harder, and Sarah was sick for the first few months, barely able to keep food down. Hollis worried constantly, remembering how worn down she had been during the fever, but Sarah insisted she was fine. She gave birth in January during a blizzard that cut them off from town. There was no time to fetch the doctor, and Hollis had to deliver the baby himself with only Sarah's instructions to guide him. It was terrifying, but somehow he managed, and their second son came into the world screaming his lungs out. They named him William, though everyone called him Billy from the start. The years passed in a blur of work and children and small joys. The ranch prospered, and they were able to build a bigger house, a real house with 4 bedrooms and a proper kitchen. Sarah had a sewing room of her own, and Hollis built her a garden bigger than she had ever dreamed of. They planted fruit trees and berry bushes, and in the summer the children would come in with their hands stained purple from raspberries. Tommy grew into a serious boy who loved the ranch and the animals. By the time he was 10, he was helping his father with the cattle, learning to rope and ride and all the skills he would need to run the ranch someday. Kathy was gentler, preferring to help her mother in the house and garden, but she had a way with the horses that amazed everyone. Billy was the wild one, always getting into trouble, always making them laugh. Sarah and Hollis grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. They had fights sometimes, about money or the children or the 100 small things that married people argue about. But they always worked through it, always came back to the foundation of respect and affection that had been there from the beginning. On their 10th anniversary, Hollis gave Sarah a rocking chair he had made himself, carved with flowers and birds. "For the porch," he said. "So you can sit and sew and watch the sun set." Sarah cried when she saw it, recognizing the bird pattern from the small carved figure he had given her all those years ago. "I love it," she said. "I love you." "I love you too," Hollis said, pulling her close. "Best decision I ever made, riding into town that night when you were sick." "Best decision I ever made, letting you stay," Sarah said, and they laughed together, remembering, when Sarah was 35, she realized she was pregnant again. It was a surprise, as they had thought they were done having children. Billy was already 7 and they had settled into a comfortable routine, but life had a way of surprising you, and 9 months later, Sarah gave birth to another daughter. They named her Grace, because she felt like a gift they had not expected. Grace was the baby of the family, adored by her older siblings and spoiled by everyone. She had Hollis's smile and Sarah's determination, and from the moment she could walk, she was into everything. She wanted to do what Tommy did, wanted to help Kathy with the horses, wanted to follow Billy on his adventures. She was exhausting and delightful in equal measure. The children grew and the ranch prospered. Tommy turned 18 and started courting the daughter of a rancher from the next valley over. Her name was Margaret, and she was a sweet girl who fit into the family like she had always been there. They were married when Tommy was 20, and Sarah became a grandmother 2 years later when Margaret gave birth to twin boys. Kathy never married, much to the confusion of everyone who knew her. She was beautiful and kind, and she had plenty of suitors, but none of them interested her. "I am happy here," she told Sarah when Sarah gently asked about it. "I have the horses and the ranch and all of you. I do not need anything else." Sarah understood, remembering her own years alone before Hollis. She hugged her daughter and told her that happiness was what mattered, not what other people expected. Billy left the ranch when he was 19, determined to see something of the world. He went to Denver and then to San Francisco, writing long letters home about his adventures. Sarah worried about him constantly, but Hollis reminded her that the boy needed to find his own way. Billy came home 3 years later with a Chinese wife named May and stories that kept them entertained for months. Grace was the last to leave, marrying a schoolteacher from Redemption Creek when she was 22. They moved into town, and Grace threw herself into community work the way her mother once had. She organized charity drives and taught Sunday school and was beloved by everyone who knew her. As Sarah and Hollis entered their 50s, they found themselves with an empty nest for the first time in decades. The house that had once rung with children's laughter was quiet, and it took some getting used to, but there were compensations. They had time for each other again, time for long rides into the mountains and quiet evenings on the porch. The ranch was thriving under Tommy's management, with Billy helping when he was not working his own small parcel of land. Jack had retired and sold his share of the partnership to Tommy, and he lived in a small house on the property where he could watch his godchildren grow up. Sarah's hair had gone gray, and Hollis's face was lined from years in the sun, but they were healthy and happy. They had built a good life together, exactly the kind of life they had dreamed of that day overlooking the valley. On their 30th anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There were 14 grandchildren by then, ranging in age from 12 to just a few months, and the house was chaos and joy in equal measure. They roasted a pig and played music and danced under the stars. "Speech," Tommy called out at one point, and everyone took up the chant. "Speech, speech." Holly stood reluctantly, pulling Sarah up beside him. "I am not much for speeches," he said, his arm around his wife's waist, "but I will say this. 30 years ago, I rode into Redemption Creek and met this woman. She had just spent weeks caring for the whole town, making soup for everyone who was sick, and she had worn herself down to nothing. When she got sick herself, I knew I had to help her the way she had helped everyone else. I thought I was just bringing her some soup and sitting with her through the fever, but what I really did was find the other half of my soul." Sarah was crying now, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Sarah Holloway, you have made my life better every single day," Hollis continued. "You have given me children and grandchildren and more love than any man deserves. You have worked beside me through hard times and good times, and you have never wavered. I am the luckiest man alive, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." The family erupted in applause and cheers. Sarah threw her arms around Hollis's neck and kissed him, not caring that everyone was watching. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "Thank you for bringing me that soup." "Thank you for letting me stay," Hollis whispered back. The party went on late into the night, and when everyone had finally gone home or gone to bed, Sarah and Hollis sat on the porch in the rocking chairs they had acquired over the years. The stars were brilliant overhead, and the night air was cool and sweet. "Do you ever think about that spring?" Sarah asked, her hand in Hollis's. "When the fever went through town, sometimes," Hollis admitted. "I think about how close I came to losing you before I ever really had you. It terrifies me, even now." "I think about how you came to me when I was sick," Sarah said. "How you stayed even though you barely knew me. You brought me soup the way I had brought soup to everyone else, and you gave me more than just care. You gave me hope. You gave me everything, Hollis said. A home, a family, a purpose. I was just drifting before I met you, working and saving but not really living. You taught me what it means to be truly alive. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that only comes after decades of companionship. In the distance, a coyote howled, and one of the horses whinnied in response. The ranch settled around them, solid and real, a testament to everything they had built together. Sarah thought about the girl she had been at 22, alone in her little house, making soup for sick neighbors and trying to find meaning in her solitary life. She thought about the fever that had nearly killed her, about the cowboy who had appeared at her bedside like something out of a dream. She thought about the decades that had followed, the hard work and the children and the slow, steady building of a life together. I would do it all again, she said suddenly, every bit of it, even the hard parts, even the fever, because it brought me to you. I would do it all again too, Hollis said, squeezing her hand. Every single day if it meant ending up here with you. They rocked in silence as the moon rose over the mountains, two old people who had loved each other well and built something lasting. The soup Sarah had made all those years ago had been just soup, simple and nourishing. But the care behind it, the act of showing up for people who needed help, had set in motion a chain of events that had changed everything. Hollis had brought her soup when she was sick, had cared for her the way she had cared for others, and in doing so had shown her that she was worth caring for. That simple act of reciprocity had opened her heart to the possibility of love, and everything else had flowed from there. As Sarah drifted off to sleep that night, Hollis's arms around her in the bed they had shared for 3 decades, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had lived a good life, a full life, a life rich with love and meaning. She had been blessed beyond measure, and she knew it. The years continued to pass, as years always do. Sarah and Hollis grew older, their children grew up and had children of their own, and the ranch continued to thrive. They faced new challenges as they aged, aches and pains and the inevitable slowing down that comes with time. But they faced it together the way they had faced everything else. When Sarah was 60, she had a scare with her heart. The doctor in Redemption Creek, a young man who had taken over from Dr. Sullivan when the old doctor retired, said she needed to slow down and rest more. Sarah ignored him as much as she could, stubborn to the end, but Hollis made sure she took her medicine and did not overexert herself. "You are not allowed to leave me yet," he told her fiercely. "We have more years to share, more grandchildren to meet, more sunsets to watch. You are stuck with me, Sarah Holloway." "I would not have it any other way," Sarah said, touching his weathered face with her wrinkled hand. They made it to their 40th anniversary, surrounded by 4 children, 16 grandchildren, and the first of what would become many great-grandchildren. The celebration was held at the ranch, with tables set up outside and enough food to feed a small army. It was loud and chaotic and perfect, exactly the kind of family gathering Sarah loved. "Look at what we made," Hollis whispered to her as they watched their descendants laugh and play. "Look at this beautiful family. We made it together," Sarah reminded him. "Everything good in my life came from you, and everything good in mine came from you," Hollis said. Tommy gave a toast that made everyone cry, talking about his parents' love story and how it had shaped all of their lives. "My father brought my mother soup when she was sick," he said. "And in doing so, he showed all of us what love really means. It is not just grand gestures and romantic words. It is showing up. It is taking care of someone when they need it. It is staying when things are hard. My parents have loved each other through illness and health, through lean years and prosperous ones, through the chaos of raising 4 children and the joy of watching those children grow. They have built something that will last long after they are gone, and we are all better for it." More years passed. Sarah's heart troubled her more often, and she had to take regular medicine and rest frequently. Hollis developed arthritis in his hands, the price of decades of hard work, and he could no longer do the heavy labor on the ranch. But they were together, and that was what mattered. They spent their days quietly now, sitting on the porch and watching the world go by. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren came to visit, bringing noise and laughter and life. Tommy ran the ranch with the help of his sons, and it was more prosperous than ever. Billy had become a successful businessman in Denver, though he came home often. Kathy still lived on the ranch in her own small house, caring for the horses she loved. And Grace was a pillar of Redemption Creek, carrying on her mother's legacy of caring for others. On a warm September afternoon, just after their 45th anniversary, Sarah and Hollis sat on the porch as they had done countless times before. The valley spread before them, golden with autumn grass, and the mountains rose purple against the sky. The house behind them was quiet, everyone gone home after Sunday dinner. "You remember the day I proposed?" Hollis asked, his voice soft with memory. "Of course I remember," Sarah said, her hand in his as always. "We stood in this valley and you told me you loved me." "It was the happiest day of my life up to that point." "What about after that point?" Hollis teased gently. "Every day with you has been the happiest day of my life," Sarah said seriously. "Even the hard ones, even the days when we fought or when money was tight or when the children were sick. Because I was with you and that made everything bearable." "I love you, Sarah Holloway," Hollis said. "I have loved you from the moment I saw you carrying that basket through town. I will love you for whatever time we have left, and I will love you beyond that." "I love you too," Sarah said. "Thank you for bringing me soup all those years ago. Thank you for staying. Thank you for building this life with me." They sat together as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. The wind whispered through the aspens, and somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed. It was an ordinary moment, unremarkable except for the profound peace that filled it. Sarah leaned her head on Hollis's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her. They had been together for more than half their lives now, had weathered every storm and celebrated every joy together. They had built a family and a home and a legacy that would outlast them. And it had all started with soup, with the simple act of caring for someone in need. As the stars began to appear overhead, Sarah thought about the circle of care that had defined her life. She had made soup for her neighbors when they were sick, giving freely of her time and energy because it was the right thing to do. And when she had needed help, when the fever had laid her low, someone had cared for her in return. That reciprocity had opened her heart to love, and everything else had followed. The soup itself had not been magic. It had been chicken broth and vegetables, simple and nourishing. But the intention behind it, the message that you are not alone, that someone sees you and cares about your suffering, that had been transformative. Sarah had given that gift to her neighbors, and Hollis had given it to her, and together they had built a life based on that same principle of showing up for each other. Their story was not a fairy tale. There had been no dramatic rescues or grand adventures. Just two people who had chosen each other and then kept choosing each other, day after day, year after year. Just hard work and small kindnesses and the determination to build something good, but in its own way, it was a perfect love story. Because it was real and it was lasting, and it had created something beautiful that would ripple forward through generations. Sarah and Hollis lived several more years together, surrounded by the family they had created and the land they had nurtured. They saw more grandchildren marry and more great-grandchildren born. They celebrated more anniversaries and more quiet evenings on the porch. And when Sarah finally passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 71, with Hollis holding her hand, she went knowing that she had been deeply loved and that her life had mattered. Hollis mourned her deeply, as anyone would mourn the loss of their other half. But he also celebrated her, telling stories about her to anyone who would listen. About her stubbornness and her kindness, about the spring she had made soup for the whole town, about the life they had built together. He lived 2 more years after Sarah's death, cared for by his children and sustained by the memories of their decades together. When Hollis finally joined Sarah, He was buried beside her in the small cemetery outside Redemption Creek, under the shadow of the mountains they had both loved. Their headstone was simple, just their names and dates and a single line that Tommy had chosen. They brought each other soup. The ranch continued for generations after them, run by their descendants who told the story of Sarah and Hollis to their own children and grandchildren. The story of how a woman's kindness had inspired a man's devotion, and how that devotion had grown into a love that lasted a lifetime. The story of how something as simple as soup could change everything. And in Redemption Creek, which had grown from a rough mining town into a proper community, people still remembered Sarah McKenna Holloway. They remembered her generosity during the fever of 1878, the way she had cared for her neighbors without thought for herself. And they remembered the cowboy who had loved her enough to bring her soup when she finally needed it, staying by her side and building a life with her that became legendary. It was a story told to children as an example of true love and real kindness. It was a story that reminded people that sometimes the most heroic acts are the simplest ones, that showing up for someone in their time of need can change both of your lives forever. It was a story about reciprocity and care, about community and connection, about the way small acts of kindness can ripple outward in ways we never expect. But more than anything, it was a love story. The story of Sarah and Hollis, two people who found each other at exactly the right moment, who built a life together through hard work and devotion, who loved each other deeply and well for more than 4 decades. A love that started with soup and grew into something that lasted beyond their lifetimes, living on in the stories told by their descendants and in the values they had passed down. In the end, that is perhaps the truest measure of a life well lived. Not wealth or fame or grand achievements, but the love shared and the family nurtured, and the simple acts of kindness that make the world a little bit better. Sarah brought soup to every sick neighbor in town, and a cowboy brought her some when she fell ill, and from that simple exchange came a love story for the ages, a family that would span generations and a legacy of care that would outlive them both. The soup was just soup. But the love behind it, the message that you matter and you are not alone, that was everything. And Sarah and Hollis had spent their lives passing that message along to each other and to their children and to everyone they touched. They had shown, through their daily choices and their enduring partnership, what it really means to love someone, not just in the good times but in the hard times, not just when it is easy but when it requires sacrifice, not just with words but with actions, day after day after day. Their story ended, as all stories must, with death and grief and the inevitable passage of time. But it also continued, in the ranch that still stood in the valley, in the descendants who carried their names and their values, in the community that still told their story. Sarah and Hollis were gone, but their love remained, a testament to the power of showing up, of caring, of choosing each other over and over again until death finally parted them. And somewhere in the mountains of Colorado, under the vast western sky, their spirits perhaps still sit on a porch watching the sunset, hands entwined, hearts forever joined, the kind of peaceful happiness that only comes from a life lived in service to love. The soup had long since been eaten, the fever had long since passed, but the love that grew from those simple acts of kindness, that would last forever, echoing through time as a reminder of what truly matters in this brief, beautiful, difficult life we share.